What if the oldest recorded legends of human creation didn't end in the underwater palace of the Apsu, where the ancient Sumerians believed the Anunnaki gods first gave us life? What if those records were secretly rewritten, altered, and their secrets deemed forbidden long after our ancestors had already built the first towering ziggurats and developed the first 5 primeval cities to sprawl across the Mesopotamian plains? In different cultures, in different societies, in different empires and kingdoms throughout time, there is something central to nearly every religious belief throughout the millennia: that mankind was created by the gods. In over 10,000 distinct religions, an estimated 18,000 different immortal deities have been written into the archives, their presence carefully preserved in various different names, in different languages, in different corners across the world, by people who did not wish to forget. And when you trace them back far enough, they all converge on the gods who reigned over the cradle of all civilization, beings who were there from the very beginning of reality as we know it, the Anunnaki, and those who came even before them. These questions sit at the center of something genuinely strange, something that the oldest written records on Earth seem to point toward quietly, almost reluctantly, as if the people who carved these words into wet clay understood that what they were preserving was not meant to be found. Not by everyone, anyway. And yet here we are, thousands of years later, pulling these fragments out of the dust of ancient Mesopotamia and asking what it all means. Allow your mind to slowly drift through the deepest currents of antiquity, because we're traveling further back in time than the first pharaohs of Egypt, further than the first stone temples. We're going back to a time before history, as most people understand it, even begins, to the rolling floodplains between 2 great rivers, where a civilization rose so quickly that it still doesn't fully make sense. We're going all the way back to our inception to discover something that is even harder to understand still. Here we find the oldest written records known to mankind. Records written not in ink on paper, but pressed into the soft clay of the earth, baked hard by the sun, and preserved for thousands of years beneath the sands of what is now southern Iraq. And what those records describe is not a simple story. Most people encounter Mesopotamian mythology and assume the story ends at the moment of our creation, that the Anunnaki, those ancient mysterious beings described across countless texts, fashioned humanity only once, handed us the tools of civilization, and then stepped back. But some of these texts suggest something far more unsettling than that, because they speak of alterations, changes made to our form not at the beginning but later, far later, even after the flood, after everything that came before had already been washed away and rebuilt. And these accounts don't come from just one culture or one scribe working in one place. They surface again and again, in different tongues, in different centuries, all seeming to point toward the same quiet conclusion: that the Anunnaki didn't create us in one definitive act and leave the design unchanged. They revised us. They came back to the blueprint more than once, and they made distinct changes, changes that for the most part, when you look at them closely, weren't designed to make us more capable, not to sharpen the mind or extend the body's strength, but to limit us, in very particular, very deliberate ways. And then, when it was done, they worked hard to make sure we wouldn't remember any of it all. There's a phrase that ancient Assyrian scribes used to mark certain restricted tablets, Nissi Tuppi. It translates roughly as the secret of the tablet, not to be shown to the uninitiated. That designation didn't appear on ordinary records. It appeared on texts that contain knowledge considered dangerous, or sacred, or both, which raises a question that's hard to shake once you've encountered it. Why would the gods go to such extraordinary lengths to keep these later modifications hidden? Why suppress a revision? Why conceal something done to a species that, by the accounts of the same texts, had been crafted with such extraordinary care right from the beginning? Beings shaped in the image of the divine, given the intelligence to govern themselves, given language, mathematics, agriculture, the reading of the stars. Every capability they would need to not only survive, but to genuinely flourish. What could possibly require hiding after all of that? And more importantly, to what end? Because the antediluvian civilization that rose across the Mesopotamian plains was not just a series of disappointing humble settlements scratched into the riverbank. What emerged there in the age before the flood was something that defies almost every conventional assumption about what early people were capable of. They built on a scale that still draws serious academic attention, towering temple complexes rising in stepped tiers above the flat horizon, complexes whose ruins can still be found today, elaborate social systems with written law, structured governance, and specialized labor, massive geometric canals and irrigation networks that redirected the waters of the Tigris and Euphrates across hundreds of miles of otherwise dry plain, rolling fields of emmer wheat and barley stretching across the lowlands, thick reed marshlands pressing against the edges of the southern sea, lush groves of date palms heavy with fruit, extending further than any single person could walk in a day. This was not primitive. This was a world that understood itself with a clarity that scholars are still working to explain, and it rose, according to the Sumerian king's list, under the direct guidance of beings who came from somewhere else, who brought knowledge with them, and who watched over those first generations of divinely chosen kings with the attention of dedicated architects reviewing their own construction. So what changed? What brought things to the point where those same beings felt it necessary to reach back into their own creation and alter what they had so carefully designed? What exactly did they do, and how far did they go to ensure it stayed buried? Because here is the part of this story that is genuinely difficult to dismiss. The surviving records show something remarkable happening to the human race in the period following the great flood of Sumerian legend. Something that left a mark not just in one tradition, but across many. And the change they describe wasn't gradual. It wasn't the kind of slow shift you might expect from centuries of adaptation or simple cultural drift. It was sudden, dramatic, the kind of change that arrives without warning and alters everything downstream of it. Lifespans that had stretched across centuries contracted almost overnight. Capabilities that had been taken for granted in the antediluvian world simply disappeared. And the texts that recorded these changes were, in many cases, classified, hidden, or quietly buried beneath newer layers of official history and political ideology. That's the contradiction at the heart of this. And as hard as they tried, it couldn't stay hidden. Not entirely. The evidence surfaces in too many places and across too many unconnected cultures to be easily explained away or dismissed, and in that light one thing seems certain. Something happened to us after the flood. Something tremendous was done by the very beings who brought us into this world, and the shape of what was done, the pattern of it, leaves a very specific kind of trace. But to understand what they changed, we first need to see clearly what existed before the floodwaters rose, what that earlier world looked like at its peak. Because to understand a revision, you have to know the original. And the original, as preserved on the oldest cuneiform tablets unearthed from the ruins of ancient Sumer, was extraordinary in ways that are easy to underestimate and very hard to fully explain. Now, before we get entirely lost in the archives, if you are listening to this in the quiet of night, let us know where and when you are joining us from in the comments section below. It's always so comforting to know that countless listeners, scattered across distant lands and different time zones, are all settling into the same incredible journey through the forgotten echoes of human history. And if you are enjoying this Sumerian history for sleep narrative, finding it helps you relax or even drift off, consider subscribing to the channel. It helps support our efforts to keep bringing you these ancient stories each week and continue reaching others who are searching for the same calm place to relax and unwind. If you would like uninterrupted sleep and longer versions, those are available to you through the Legends of the Dawn membership. And now we return to the very heart of ancient Sumeria, the place from which all things began, to the first kingships sent down from the heavens, to the sacred knowledge flowing from the realms above, and the life-giving depths of the Apsu bubbling up from below, the age of early invention, of learning and building and reaching for the stars, when humanity was still living in the long shadow of its own divine origins. The true mystery of our tale begins right after the moment that most interpretations of this tradition treat as the definitive end of humanity's origin story. In the space between our initial creation and the great storm that set their civilization back for who knows how long, before the revision, before whatever came after, there was a world that the Sumerian kings list describes in numbers so enormous that they barely feel like history at all. 8 kings, each one ruling for tens of thousands of years at a time, a combined reign of somewhere around 241,000 some years. And the first of those kings ruled from a city so old, so buried now beneath the silt and the silence of southern Iraq, that most people have never heard its name. Eridu, the first primeval capital, the city the Sumerians themselves believed was the very beginning of everything. And in the texts they left behind, we can gain a small glimpse of the city as it was then, or at least come as close as we can get, standing this far away from it. A low, flat horizon dissolving into water on every side, dense reed thickets pushing up from the dark mud, swaying in the salt-tinged wind that drifted in off the sparkling southern seas. Morning mist sitting heavy over the channels, blurring the line between the land and the sea and the sky above it all. This was a world where those boundaries didn't feel like a boundary at all, where the physical and the divine seemed to occupy the same humid, shimmering air. The Sumerians placed Eridu at the dedicated center of reverence to the Apsu, the primordial fresh water which lay deep beneath the earth, that sacred underground ocean from which Enki, their god of wisdom, was said to draw his power. To live in Eridu was to live directly above the source of all knowledge. And like all those first sovereigns of their era, the king who ruled there was explicitly said to have been sent down to guide the earth from the heavens themselves. His name was Allulim, the first king of ancient Sumer and of Eridu, and according to the king's list, he reigned for 28,800 years, a number that, all on its own, tends to stop people cold. And the surrounding context is even greater, because Allulim was only the first of 8 rulers who, collectively, spanned the entire Antediluvian age. 8 kings, over 200,000 years, one city giving way to the next, slowly but surely, without any dispute over who would take the throne. For the gods themselves had chosen these sovereigns, and through all of it, those early humans didn't navigate the complexity of civilization alone. That's where the Apkallu came in, the 7 sages, each one being designated to a specific king, every king but the last. They were beings described as having emerged from the water itself, rising out of the muddy deltas near Eridu. Wrapped in the skins of the sacred Eridu fish, their forms clearly reflective of the language of the deep from which they had been created. Whether you read them as literal figures or as something more symbolic, what the texts consistently attribute to them is striking. They were incredibly wise and patient teachers, emissaries carrying a specific kind of knowledge that the newly shaped humans could not have so quickly arrived at on their own. The Apkallu are described as the ones who revealed the hidden mechanisms, rules, and sacred parameters of all existence, the patterns running beneath the surface of things. The city of Eridu had been chosen as the first place to begin that transmission of hidden knowledge, known as the Holy May, a wisdom that was far older than any of us, including the Anunnaki themselves. And what they handed down was more incredible than anyone alive at the time could possibly have expected. Some of the first great developments to come from it appeared in their language, in the written word, because writing, as it appears in ancient Sumer, is one of the genuinely strange mysteries of the early historical record. That wedge-pressed system of symbology and odd marks pressed into wet river clay with a slender reed. What we call cuneiform appears suddenly in the archaeological record without any of the usual characteristics of development behind it. Other writing systems always leave traces of their evolution. It's inevitable, a necessary process beginning with rough early forms that slowly sharpen into something more refined and take on new and more complex meanings over centuries. Cuneiform doesn't behave that way. It arrives in a heartbeat in the historical context, already structured, already capable of recording complex thought. And the sages of Eridu, according to the Sumerian tradition, are the ones who placed the reed in our hands and showed us each careful stroke. Mathematics came alongside it, and with mathematics came astronomy, the ability to watch the distant wheeling of planets against the fixed backdrop of stars and understand that this movement was not random, that it was cyclical, that it could be tracked, and that it could be used. Farmers began synchronizing their planting with the turning of the sky. The seasons became readable. The earth became manageable in a way it simply hadn't been before. The building had also begun very shortly after the first people. What started as a calm settlement by the sea rapidly became a sprawling metropolis in its own right. And one of its most glorious achievements was the temple known as Iron-Gor, or Absu, the ziggurat at the heart of Eridu, dedicated to the wise water god himself. And astonishingly enough, its excavations in the 20th century show 18 consecutive layers of construction, each one built directly on top of the last, not rebuilt from scratch, not abandoned and restarted somewhere else nearby. Layer upon layer, one careful foundation pressed down onto the bones of the one before it, continuing their ancestors' work, expanding and broadening it until it cast a towering shadow across the winding walkways of bustling marketplaces below, reaching for the sky. That kind of continuity, that kind of dedication and desire to improve the world around them, speaks to a society that knew what it was doing and had a very clear idea of where it was going. There are no fumbling early attempts buried in those layers, no long stretch of failed experiments, gradually improving towards something more workable. We are left with no better explanation for it all than that which the ancients gave us. Their knowledge appears to have been there from the beginning, just as they claimed, already whole, already precise, already pointing forward at the distant horizon. The physical manifestations of a grand plan that had already been laid out at the moment of our inception. Solid foundations that would carry their civilization through everything yet to come, and everything that our very species as a whole would come to be. So the groundwork had been laid down, not tentatively, but with the kind of certainty that doesn't come from a mere guess. It comes from something already known, already decided. And whatever had been seeded in those earliest centuries of their society, it didn't stay contained to a single city. It spread far and wide across the rolling Mesopotamian plains. After Eridu, they moved northward, first to the green pastoral grasslands and glowing copper forges of Bad Tibira, where they had begun unlocking the earliest secrets of metallurgy, learning how to pull metal from raw ore, how to shape it, how to use it. That knowledge of working fire against earth, to produce something neither fire nor earth could produce alone, would travel forward with them through centuries. And then they spread further still, to Larak, tucked beneath an endless canopy of vast date palm orchards, cooled by sweet water channels that had been cut into the earth in careful geometric patterns. Larak was a city built around harmony. The wild growth had been fully tamed into something that looked less like wilderness and more like carefully cultivated intent. A city that lived in harmony with the land rather than on top of it. Then came the great capital of Sippar, and Sippar was something else entirely. This was the solar city, the city of the sun god Utu, or Shamash, and it was said to bask in his light from the first pale hour of morning until the last orange burnt edge of the evening sunset. The Euphrates River split its sprawling streets directly down its center, two halves of the same radiant whole, quickly becoming the dominant northern gateway and primary inland port of all of Lower Mesopotamia, connecting them to the rich resources their surrounding environment lacked. Volumes of cedar and pine timber from the upper Syrian forests, silver and copper from the mountains of Anatolia in what we now know as Turkey. It was here that one of the most extraordinary sovereign figures in all of Sumerian tradition came to power. His name was Enlil and Enki, king of Sippar, and according to the ancient records, a man who did not fulfill his reign by staying confined to the earthly realm, but by rising into the celestial skies above it. From an elevated platform atop his towering temple, he was said to have ascended back into the heavens from which he came, alongside his Apkallu advisor, the wise sage Tuabzu. Together they traveled through regions beyond ordinary reach, directly into the luminous halls of the gods themselves, to receive wisdom that no human had ever been granted before. What he brought back was startling in its scope. He returned with the knowledge of lecanomancy, the art of reading iridescent oil patterns as they spread across the still surface of water, the knowledge of the heavenly tablets, of celestial observation, of methods for decoding divine intention, methods that pushed human understanding far past whatever limits had previously existed. Sippar, under his reign, had become a city operating at the absolute outer edge of what the tablets suggest was permissible, a city that was stretching the furthest bounds of mortal capability, turning into a sort of pressure which eventually would come to press against the earth with such a weight, and grow so loud with the bustle of advanced life, that it would strain the very foundations of their bond to the divine. And when they finally expanded to the great capital of Shuruppak, the fifth and last primeval city, under the last chapter of the Antediluvian world, that strain was never more evident. Here the wise king Ubaratutu ruled side by side with his son, the prince, the man who would become legendary, Zu-Sudra. By the time Shuruppak reached the height of its power, something had shifted, not in one city, but across all of them. No matter what the gods had originally created humanity for, by this point they had seemingly done their job almost too well. The streets of Shuruppak were dense with people and motion. Markets overflowed with goods, with voices, with the smell of roasted grain and raw livestock, and fresh-cut timber all mixed together under the open sky. The granaries were straining at their seams. The canal grids that had once been open and precise were now being choked by lush overgrowth that crept between every hard-baked brick. And rising above it all, above the noise of the markets and the alleys and the constant low hum of thousands of lives being lived at once, was something the ancient texts describe with a single word: clamor. That word deserves more weight than it usually gets. The tablet known as BM 78941, just one piece of the Atrahasis epic, reveals how Enlil grew disturbed by this clamor. The standard reading positions it simply: humanity was too loud. Enlil couldn't sleep. But that reading sits on the surface of something far deeper, a greater underlying meaning hidden in all of that noise. These were not people simply shouting in the street. These were long-lived, capable, rapidly expanding beings who had inherited something extraordinary, locked forever into their own blood. The tablets suggest that the primordial essence used in their creation carried within it a genetic weight, one that was far heavier than any simple labor force was ever supposed to carry. And across the antediluvian centuries, that inheritance had not faded. If anything, it had grown. The Lulu, the mortal workers the Anunnaki had fashioned, were no longer recognizable as the humble instruments of earthly and societal maintenance they had been designed to be. They were pressing forward. They were accumulating knowledge at a rapid pace, sharing it, refining it, and the distance between them and the gods was narrowing in ways that couldn't be ignored. When you look deeper, what you find in those tablets is not just a god who lost sleep over noise. What you find is a god who looked down at what had been built, what had been learned, what was still being learned, and recognized a problem that no amount of restraint was going to solve quietly. The clamor Enlil heard was the sound of a species beginning to close a gap it was never supposed to close. Enlil decided that the only answer was something total, not a warning, not a limitation carefully imposed from above, a reset, complete, deliberate, and designed to reach all the way down to the biological foundations of what humanity had become. But to fully understand what drove that decision, we have to step back. Not into the flood itself, but into something quieter. Something about our origin story that most people who study this period have walked right past, without even realizing what they were looking at. Because scattered across the climate-controlled storage rooms of some of the world's most treasured museums, there are other fragments, damaged, incomplete, and written in a language that took scholars generations to decipher. And one of them in particular changes the shape of everything we thought we knew about the first people to walk the marshy banks of Eridu. That tablet is catalogued as KAR4, and it doesn't get talked about nearly enough. Now make no mistake, these written traditions are not a single unified account. They never were. What we actually have is a collection of traditions that contradict each other in ways that are small enough to be dismissed, but significant enough that scholars have spent decades trying to explain them. From the Enuma Elish to the Atrahasis epic and beyond, we find Sumerian texts that point to the Igigi's rebellion as the sole cause of our creation, where others claim we were always much more than just mere laborers. Babylonian texts that claim we were brought to life by the immortal blood of not just any god, but one of the even older primordial titans. A general of the greatest army the Anunnaki had ever faced, rather than a simple lesser god within their own pantheon. And that distinction is not a small one, because if human life carries the blood of something that ancient, something that powerful, something that came before even the Anunnaki themselves, then the question of what humanity was capable of becoming takes on an entirely different meaning. And beneath all of these variations sits an older, less frequently spoken layer of Sumerian material, one that doesn't always agree with either of them. Kar-4. Discovered in the ruins of the ancient Assyrian city of Assur, this tablet is bilingual, written in both Sumerian and Akkadian, which already tells you something about how important this particular text was considered to be. But what makes it most strange is what it describes. Not the familiar mass creation of a generic labor class, not the broadly stroked story of humanity shaped from clay and set to work. Instead, Kar-4 describes a separate creation event, a specific deliberate act in which the first two humans are given individual names, Uligara and Enagara. Not broad categories, not just the first of mankind, actual names. And that alone matters more than one might think at first. Because in the ancient traditions, to name something to give it identity was to define its purpose and assign it a permanent place and function in the greater order of things. And the identity they assigned here was not one of simple caretakers assigned to the mines and harvests and serving the high gods. They were something else, something marked from the beginning as distinct, as elevated, as carrying a different relationship to the divine entirely. What the tablet suggests, if you read it carefully, is that ancient scribes were aware of two separate lineages of humanity developing in the world before the flood. The first was the Lulu, the broad population, the working mass of people created to maintain the cosmic order by turning the earthly realm into the lush paradise their creators had envisioned. The second was something even more miraculous, or perhaps more precisely, something more deliberate. A secret and carefully hidden bloodline, one that moved under the guidance of Enki specifically. Not the general population as overseen at a distance, but a line watched closely, shaped with intention, and given a standing that set them apart from everyone else around them. Later scribal traditions appear to have worked very hard to fold this distinction into the background. Those tablets that still contain the echoes of this mystery were among some of those marked by the Nissi Tuppi, the mark of restriction, forbidden to most. The institutions that preserved and copied these texts across centuries were not neutral archivists. They were attached to temples, to royal courts, to administrative structures with strong interests in maintaining a particular picture of what humanity was and where it came from. A single origin story is far easier to control than one with branches. A unified labor class is far simpler to govern than a population that contains, somewhere within it, a line that traces back to immortal ancestors that the gods themselves considered dangerous. And so, those traces were compressed. The names disappeared from most versions of the law. The two populations became one, and the seam was sewn closed so well that most never even noticed it was there. But the question it raises doesn't disappear just because the answer itself was buried. If the ordinary population of humanity had already grown loud enough and numerous enough and capable enough to disturb Enlil, what exactly did a second lineage represent? One that was elevated above all others, even though both factions were said to have carried the same divine blood. A lineage personally guided by Enki himself, the same god who brought the entire species into existence. If the general noise of ordinary human ambition was enough to bring Enlil to the decision of total erasure, then the existence of Uligara and Enagara, and whatever came after them, was something far more unsettling than noise. It was a question about succession, about what happens when a species built from such powerful material starts to remember what it carries inside it. Something that could not, in the gods' eyes, be allowed to run rampant. And so we come back to the ultimate decision of the high god Enlil. lord of sweeping winds and raging storms, the first of the Anunnaki to enter the world as we know it, the one who in the very beginning forced the great mound of An and Ki, the heavens and the earth apart, carving out the space between them and drawing the first breath of moving air into existence. He had watched the human experiment unfold from the moment it began, had observed what started as a controlled workforce become something that grew and multiplied and dreamed for more. And now, just as his own kin had once grown too loud, too restless, too filled with their own ambitions for their ancestors, who wished only to rest in silence, the people below had started to carry that same energy, that same dangerous hum. Enlil could no longer sleep, and when a god as powerful as Enlil loses his sleep, the world tends to suffer for it. He resolved to end it all, not to limit, not to redirect, to bring it to its end. And what makes this part of the story so layered, so worth sitting with in quiet contemplation, is that the resolution he reached didn't come swiftly. It didn't come in a single decisive stroke. The Great Reset, the one that lives in the Sumerian texts and would echo forward through nearly every flood narrative, in every culture in human memory, was not just one attempt. It was three. Three separate waves of destruction, each one carefully chosen, each one resisted by the same quiet, calculating presence. Because at the center of all of it, there is a figure who appears again and again in the oldest stories of Mesopotamia, the most measured and compassionate of all the Anunnaki. The one whose name, across thousands of years of ancient literature, is woven so tightly into the act of making things that it has become nearly inseparable from creation itself. The wise god Enki, he who had shaped the first human from clay and immortal blood, who had breathed purpose into the species, who had created and sent the Apkallu to teach and guide them, and who would not, under any circumstances, allow his brother to unmake what they had built. The first wave Enlil sent did not come with clouds or rain or the sound of rising waters. It came as something more intimate, more insidious. It came as sickness, as plague. The god who carried it had many names. In this telling, he appears as Namtar, the god of fate and pestilence. In other versions, he surfaces as Era, the god of plague and war, or as Nergal, lord of the underworld, keeper of death and disease. Whatever he was called in any given telling, the role was the same. Once he fixed his attention on a population, there was no outrunning what he carried with him. The disease spread quietly at first, and then, all at once. But Enki's compassion for his creations ran as deep and as wide as the waters he governed. And so, as a young prince knelt at his temple in grief, weeping and offering his prayers into the silence, the water god made a choice. He would travel into the realm of dreams, into that soft and borderless space where gods and mortals had always been able to speak most freely, and there he would give the prince specific instructions. And as you may have already guessed, this prince was no ordinary figure. He is the same man who shows up in the Epic of Gilgamesh under the name Utanapishtim, the one man granted immortality after surviving the flood. He is Zusudra, the son of the last divinely chosen king of Shuruppak, the prince who would become the flood hero of the oldest Sumerian traditions, and possibly the earliest precursor to all like him that came after. He is, in every version, the one man trusted to carry the thread of humanity forward. And here, in the plague story, he is called Atrahasis, a name that roughly translates to the exceedingly wise. Enki gave him a strange instruction. He told the prince to command his people to stop all worship, Every offering, every prayer directed to any god at all, every god except one, the plague god himself, and so they did, sending him rich offerings and constant devotion, temples filled with the kind of attention most gods would spend centuries hoping to receive. Namtar, confronted with boundless reverence, accepted the bribe, and withdrew his plague. The second wave came as something that, both literally and metaphorically, was the perfect opposite to the flood waters yet to come. Drought, the kind that doesn't ease gently, the kind that bakes the ground until it fractures into large, irregularly shaped cracks, turns the soil to powder, and reduces plants to dry husks under a sun that simply won't relent. All food, all water, all the slow, steady sustenance of the earth pulled away. Once again Enki found his way to the prince in the hours of sleep, and once again the solution followed the same hidden logic. All offerings, all devotion redirected, this time to the storm god Adad, the one who controlled rain and the mercy of moisture. Adad, inundated with worship and uncomfortable under the shameful weight of it, bent just enough, not enough to attract notice, not a downpour, nothing so visible as real relief. Just a soft morning dew, and a quiet, carefully restrained drizzle that slipped through under the cover of what looked like ordinary weather. Just enough for the people to hold on. But Enlil had been watching. By now the shape of what was happening was becoming difficult to ignore. Someone was working against him. Quietly, carefully, undoing each attempt before it could reach its conclusion. And he wouldn't have to search long for an answer. Enlil knew, in the way that those in the highest positions of power always seem to know when someone beneath them is working against their interests. The only question now was how long Enlil would allow it to continue before doing something that couldn't be undone, and the answer was soon. Too soon, because his very next act was something far more total. He sealed the upper atmosphere and locked the boundaries of the sky closed, so that no rain could fall, not a drop, not a trace of moisture from the heavens above. Then he reached into the earth and blocked the deep veins of groundwater, so the soil cracked and went hard, and no vegetation could possibly grow. Then he waited. And for 6 long years the lands of ancient Sumeria withered, each year growing worse than the one before it, until society collapsed entirely. But they were still alive, still present, there was still something left to save. So Enki would take drastic measures of his own. To sabotage his brother's decrees, he would break the very locks of the deepest underground aquifers in his sweet freshwater palace of Apsu, sending not only water, but with it plenty of fish to feed the people, at least for now. Because when Enlil looked down and saw humans thriving, surviving and making noise once more, he fell into a dark rage. Something shifted in him. Pure, cold fury. He immediately called for every single member to convey, gathering the full council together in the luminous halls of the heavenly assembly. And there he directly accused his brother of treason. He laid out what Enki had done, each interference, each quiet reversal, each time the plan had been allowed to fail, not by chance, but by deliberate design. And then he demanded something he had never asked for before, an unbreakable oath, a secret decree that sealed the fate of every living thing on earth. The flood would come. But this time, no one would be permitted to warn the mortals. But Enki had already moved. In his boundless intelligence, he had found a clever loophole around his brother's decree. Without speaking directly to any man, he went to the walls of a reed hut where Zusudra slept, and he spoke to the walls themselves. Technically, he had broken no oath. He told the walls what was coming. He told them what shape the vessel should take, a great circular ark, sealed and engineered to outlast the storm. And he told them what to carry, not just a man and his family, but something far more specific. The tablets say it carried the seeds of all living things. Meanwhile, the sacred knowledge of the Apkallu, those 7 ancient sages who had carried civilization's first instructions down from the gods, was carefully buried and hidden in the vaults of Sipar. And in doing so, something else was preserved in these desperate attempts to prepare for what was coming, something the texts gesture at, without ever quite naming directly. A particular genetic line, preserved not by accident, but by intention. Ziusudra did as the walls instructed, and what came next the tablets describe with an image that is difficult to shake. The great Anunnaki, those enormous ancient beings, lifting their torches as the waters rose, standing at the edge of the celestial realms, watching the earth below disappear beneath the surge of the deep oceans and the collapse of the sky. Their bright golden torchlight shimmering down onto a surface that was no longer land, but something else entirely. All were in shock and awe at the deluge the high god had unleashed. Some even wept. And when the storm finally stopped, and the bitumen-sealed ark settled against the high ground of a distant mountain, the silence was total. The old world, with its enormous kings and their impossibly long reigns, and the dense, thriving population that had filled those 5 primeval cities, was gone. All of it, submerged, the slate wiped clean, as completely as anything in recorded history, leaving behind a trace of fine sediments that can still be found to this day, and what was left was very small and very quiet, a single preserved remnant stepping out into an empty world. But what the survivors carried with them was different now, and what they would pass on to the generations that followed would be different too. In the end, the flood had not been a simple act of finite destruction, as Enlil had imagined. It had been a filter, a deliberate biological reset, which would select only specific threads of humanity to carry forward. While everything else that the old knowledge, the old lengths of life, the old inheritance that the Antediluvian kings had held, was swallowed by the water and buried under the sediment of the deep. This was the cost, and it was a cost the gods had not fully calculated before they voted, and one that would not be fully understood until the gods sat down together in the quiet that followed the waters. Because when Ziusudra finally made landfall and prepared the first offering the gods had received since the flood swept the earth clean, something unexpected happened. The gods swarmed around it. That is the word the texts use. They swarmed, like flies drawn to the smell of something they had been denied for too long. Driven by hunger, driven by a need they had not anticipated, and Enki, who had always been the quieter strategist of the two, used that moment. He let Enlil feel it, the absence, the silence that had replaced the smoke of 10,000 offerings rising up from the plains of Sumer. And then he made his argument. Humanity was not simply a minor force anymore. Mankind had become something the gods genuinely needed and could not sustainably continue without. The Anunnaki could not rule the earth and maintain it at the same time. They never could. That was the original problem, the one that had started all of this, going all the way back to the first days of their arrival with the Ijiji. So the council gathered. And what followed is one of the strangest recorded moments in all of ancient history. Enlil could not argue with the logic, but he was not willing to let it stand without conditions. And so they rewrote the rules. He pressed Enki and Ninmah, the mother of creation who had helped to shape us, to agree to something formal. Something binding, a new biological framework for the species they were choosing to preserve. Because if humanity was going to continue, it was going to continue differently than it had before. What had existed before the flood, those lifespans that stretched across tens of thousands of years, that level of knowledge and reach, that could not be allowed to return. And the lifespan was only the beginning, because the texts go further than that. They describe specific forces, specific classes of beings given precise functions. The Pashatu were among them. Spirits designated to take children, to move through the spaces where new life was most fragile and most vulnerable. These are often interpreted as mythological representations of disease or as the natural phenomena of sudden mortality in an ancient world. But in the original context, they read differently. They read like an intentional role being given, a specific purpose set into law. And trailing behind them in the later Mesopotamian tradition came the Lilitu, female wind demons believed to circle women who were carrying the spark of life, lingering just at the edges of the nursery. They were the precursor to the figure eventually known as Lilith. And beyond that, the texts describe a portion of women who were now to be born without the ability to conceive at all, and the creation of a class of high priestesses who would remain celibate by choice, devoted entirely to the temple, their fertility consecrated to the gods rather than to the continuation of the population. The effect of all of this, taken together, was a kind of permanent ceiling placed over human numbers, a population that could never quite outgrow its boundaries, could never become loud enough or dense enough to threaten the order being rebuilt above it. But the deepest revision was not biological in the way we would normally use that word. They had altered our forms and our very DNA yet again. But the tablets also describe something being severed that had nothing to do with our physical bodies. Not directly. The connection between the mortal world and the planes above it, that bridge that the Antediluvian sages had once walked freely, was now closed. Human perception was described as being clouded, bound to physical, linear time in a way it had never been before. The ability to reach upward, to touch what existed beyond the tangible and the visible matter, was dimmed at its very source. And then there were the sages themselves. The Seven Apkallu, those ancient fish-cloaked teachers who had carried divine knowledge up from the deep waters beneath the earth, had been locked away during the flood. The god Era had sealed the gates behind them as the waters rose, and those gates did not open again. The sages who appeared in the post-flood world were already described in the texts as diminished. 2/3 sage, the sources say, some even less so, all of them partially human, and with each generation that followed, the line between sage and ordinary priest grew thinner until it disappeared entirely. The direct channel had been closed. What remained was only what had managed to survive the water, what had been buried in vaults, pressed into clay, sealed into the walls of temples, and hidden in the foundations of cities that the flood had not quite fully consumed. And so the story settled, the way all great floods eventually do, into stillness. What had been taken could not be returned. What had been altered could not be undone. But something remained, something that no decree and no revision pressed into clay could reach. Deep inside the design of our species, quiet and patient as a seed beneath winter soil, the original spark held on. The blood of the old world, the primordial essence folded into clay at the very beginning, never fully went out. It only waited the way embers wait beneath ash, warm and hidden, and entirely certain of their own radiant glow. And what happened next was remarkable, not in a sudden or dramatic way, but in the slow, accumulating way that rivers carve stone. Despite every measure taken to diminish the reach of human awareness, people built. They gathered at river bends and laid the first courses of mud brick. They raised ziggurats towards stars they had not stopped watching. They pressed meaning into wet clay with thin reeds, and they handed those meanings forward across generations, wrapped in story and symbology, in legends and in songs. The same longing shows up in every corner of the ancient world, a different name, a different sky, a different language, but the same reaching, the same deep sense that we come from something older and larger than we can quite remember. That thread has never truly broken. And as we watch night fall over the wide flat plain between the ancient rivers, we see that persistence clearly in the first cities to rise after the waters receded. Over Kish and Uruk and where the first fires of the rebuilt world burn small and steady against the dark. The air is cool here, carrying the soft mineral smell of river silt and the sweetness of date palms along the bank. Somewhere above the highest altar of a ziggurat, incense smoke drifts upward in a slow, dissolving curl, rising toward a sky that holds more stars than you can count. Inside the quiet archive rooms of the tablet houses where knowledge lived, the scribes have set down their reeds for the night. The damp clay rests in darkness, curing slowly, sealing its secrets softly into itself. The only sound is the occasional breath of wind through a narrow window, and then nothing. The river drifts steadily along soft currents in the dark, the way it has always moved. It was moving before the flood, and it was moving after, and it is moving still, carrying everything forward in a current that has no beginning you can point to, and no end you can see. The same stars that turned slowly above the silent courts of Alulim are turning overhead now, the same patient arc across the same deep sky, unhurried and indifferent to the centuries stacked beneath them. Let the current carry you through their rejuvenating waters. There is nothing left to hold. The story has settled into stone and silt and the long memory of the earth that always remains. The gods watch from their old positions in the dark. The night is wide and soft and ancient, and somewhere far below the surface of waking thought, the spark continues its silent glow.